Sometimes when we begin to question our faith or have doubts about our tradition, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert. When we take a step back and honestly evaluate organized religion in the 21st century, many times it doesn't make any sense. The more we cling to it and try to save it, the worse it becomes. In addition, widespread abuse, cover-ups, and victim shaming cause some of us to question whether it will ever be right again.
The Desert Sanctuary was created by Carl and Laura Forehand. It consists of a podcast, a blog, along with Carl and Laura's writing.
We're happy you're here. Welcome to the show. Hi, welcome to the Desert Sanctuary. I'm Laura Forehand. We're happy that you're with us this afternoon. I'm here with Carl Forehand. I'm always supposed to say that. I'm not sure why, but I don't know what other Carl they would think I was with. And we're here with a very special guest, somebody that's been in our lives for a very long time and has helped us through a lot of stuff. So I'm looking forward to that discussion. But before we start that, before I read the bio, what do you need to share with us?
Yeah, not much really. Just to say, that Paul's, probably mentioned, Paul Fitzgerald is mentioned in most of my books. That's because he's a part of my life, and I'm grateful for it. It's been, I think the best teachers come kind of in and out of your life at the right time, and so on. So, I'm thankful for that, and we want to draw from his wisdom as much as we can. So we'll do that today, and it's going to be fun. Also, the book Out into the Desert for 5 months has stayed up in the top 50 in its category. It's still going. It's kind of riding a wave. We try a bunch of stuff to make it go better, and then it doesn't. And then you mean you, because I really don't. And you don't know what works and what doesn't work, but we appreciate everybody kind of sharing in that discussion with us and sharing it with your friends, evaluating it. There's only been a couple of little 1-star ratings that just didn't like the idea that I thought differently than them. And I don't know what you can do about that. I don't know. But it's received pretty good ratings and good. It's been received well overall. Just hopeful that all different pieces of life that think differently, we want them all to discuss this issue of, what about organized religion in the 21st century? Do we even need it? Do we need it? What are the things that need to be fixed if it's going to go on, and things like that. So we want that conversation to continue. We hope it will. At the same time, we're working on a couple of new things, right? My novel is finishing up, hopefully tomorrow.
It's been, you've been wanting to finish it all weekend.
Dragging this last chapter out for a couple of months here. But anyway, that's continuing. That's what we got going on. But we're not here to talk about that today. We're here to talk to Dr. Paul. Yeah. And Laura, tell us who Dr. Paul is.
Well, in addition to being just kind of, I feel like a lifelong friend. And, when I talk about someone who has earned the right to hear my story, I think of Dr. Paul and Susanna. So Dr. Paul Fitzgerald earned the Doctorate of Ministry with research in internalized shame and trauma. For more than 25 years, he and his wife, Susanna, have assisted people in wholehearted, authentic living through HeartConnexion Seminars. His professional training includes inner relationship focusing and BioSpiritual Focusing. He is a member of the International Focusing Institute and BioSpiritual Focusing Institute. HCA, which is HeartConnexion Seminars, HCS Focusing is a process for individuals to discover life-forwarding change through awareness of inner wisdom that results in confident living in any life situation. HCS Focusing is based on the extensive research work of Eugene Gendlin. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Yeah. Well, Gendlin. Okay, sorry. PhD, and his discovery of focusing as a way of becoming aware of our inner relationship with the felt sense and inner wisdom leading deep change. He has professional training in inner relationship focusing with Weiser, Cornell, and Barbara McGavin, as well as training in BioSpiritual Focusing through the BioSpiritual Institute. He is also a member of the International Focusing Institute and the BioSpiritual Institute. That's impressive. That's an impressive resume, Dr. Paul.
Proud of you.
Well,
So glad that you're here with us today on the Desert Sanctuary. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Recently, somebody asked me how to identify myself, and I said WOF. And of course, he said, "What does WOF mean?" I said, "Well, wise old fart."
Yeah,
That'll work.
Yeah,
That'll work.
Definitely. Lots of knowledge and wisdom to share.
So we both attended the breakthrough seminars. Actually, both of us went through twice, in maybe 20 years apart, 15 years apart. And most of the focus in breakthrough in the earlier years was on was shame.
Yeah.
And then now, having some focus now on focusing, BioSpiritual Focusing and all that. And we'll talk about all that. But the first question I want to ask is, I know for a fact that over the last 25 years, you and Susanna have seen a lot of church harm. We used to call it church hurt, but that sounds a little bit like butt hurt or something like that. It's church harm. And can you talk a little bit about that? What are the factors that go into causing church harm? People will react to that and they'll say, well, it doesn't happen here. We're not as bad as the Baptist church and so on. But the fact is it happens.
Yeah.
What have you noticed in 25 years of working intensely with people in groups? And what have you observed? What do you know?
Well, trauma in churches, it's kind of it's been the elephant in the room. It was only really until probably maybe 6-7 years ago that people began even writing about trauma in churches. I come from a very conservative background. It was a hellfire and brimstone small church. That's all we knew. And I did not realize how traumatic it was to be exposed 2 times every Sunday to some kind of implication that if you aren't careful, you're going to go to hell. Mm-hmm. And with a description of the fire and burning and, the unquenchable fire and all that. It was, I go back to a incident when my brother married, and the woman he married had a daughter about my age. And they came to visit, and we all went to church. And about halfway through the service, this young girl my age started crying just uncontrollably. And I didn't know if she was under conviction or what. Those are the terms those days. Mm-hmm. And so it got to be a point. I said, "Let's leave. Let's go. We'll walk home." And we had a ways to walk. And so I was asking her what was going on, and she said, "I've never heard that before. I've never been scared like that before." Mm. And what I looked like now back, it was kind of normalized trauma for me. Mm-hmm. It was so normal that I didn't even recognize its impact in my life. Mm-hmm. But it was all predicated on fear, and we didn't come from a once saved always saved. That's kind of another theological approach. Ours was, are you sure you're okay today? Because you could have been, you could have done something since the last time you were here. And, we heard stories about people who were killed in car wrecks on the way home from church. And I don't know, maybe they did or didn't. And
Right.
long altar calls and all that. But again, well-meaning people. It was their paradigm. It was how they lived and how they functioned and how they worked. And, I was in it. I was in it for a long time myself. I never could quite do the hellfire and brimstone preaching as a pastor. I couldn't get there. I would talk more about health and so forth. These days, I will tell people that I'm much more concerned about the hell you're living in than the hell you might be going to. In fact, the one of the words for hell in the New Testament is always translated. It's 4 or 5 terms translated by hell. One is Gehenna, and Gehenna now is a subdivision of Jerusalem. It was a fire pit, and I say to people, look, have you ever been asked, how do you feel? And you respond, I feel like hell. And we use that term. We don't associate with the fact that what Jesus was trying to say was talking about the quality of life you're living.
Right.
And I have worked with so many people over so many years who have had so much trauma in church, such negative images of God, such doubt planted in them, which is always kind of fascinating because I can sometimes say to them, well, isn't there a passage of scripture that says, it asks the question, what can separate us? And they can quote it. But they worry about being separated from God. And it's a conundrum. It's a paradox that I can have both that assurance, and yet it doesn't seem to apply to me. I've internalized the doubt to the extent that I worry about it all the time. I don't have peace beyond understanding. I try to understand why I should have peace or what I need to get peace and so forth. And actually, I've had training assistants. We have, for each 5 people come in the room, we have 2 training assistants. Some of them come from church backgrounds, like mine, and some of them come from no church backgrounds at all, or very, very little. And in conversations with them, among them, over and over, those who were not churched as young kids will say, I'm so glad I didn't have to recover from that. I can't believe you guys had to deal with that. I can't believe you guys had to work through that.
Yeah.
They would say, I always felt like I had a lot to carry, but when I hear what you've got, I'm so thankful I don't have to recover from that. And yet it's unseen, it's denied, it's the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about it in church.
Yeah. So normalized trauma with the doctrines, with our dogma,
right?
But also, Laura, we talk a lot about in the book, and as we're having conversations, we talk a lot about the way that church is organized. It's an organization. The organization always comes first. Sarah Bessie said, the church didn't have a room for my grief.
Right.
And like you mentioned in the beginning, I don't know a pastor that went into ministry with the intention of harming people. In fact, they have the opposite intention. Churches have the opposite intention. And a lot of times don't see what's going on. But am I right about that? Is it very possible, a person that needs to be heard, that needs to be healed, the church could be just busy enough that it doesn't have time for that. It's not organized right for that, right?
Well, the church my church experience, and I obviously can't talk for every church in the world, but my church experience was that we did a lot of pretending. There was a lot of covering up of things, a lot of duplicity. Really, you wouldn't put your laundry out at church.
Right.
In fact, I recall a Sunday school class I was not teaching. I was in it. I was in college, I guess, and it was a mixed class of older people and young people, and we were talking about something, maybe the dimensions of the ark or some really significant kind of thing. And this lady started talking, and then she started getting vulnerable about what her life was like and the relationships and situations in her home, and really asking for support and help, not in those words, but really doing that. And the whole place got quiet and nervous. It was kind of like, oh, let's go back and let's get back to the lesson. Let's get back to the lesson, because we're supposed to be beyond that. I don't want to put my dirty laundry out. But then we lie and cover it up, and we just internalize that shame. I just had a flashback of a memory when I was pastoring a small church in Kentucky. I did a 12-step group in the church, and we had people coming in from various places. And it was kind of a generic 12-step group. It wasn't issue specific. It wasn't alcohol. It was just, if your life isn't working, kind of thing. And this guy came regularly, and then one day he called me, and he said, I need to apologize for coming to your group and not coming to your church. And I said, well, that's okay, but what's the story? He said, well, I have a wife, and we've got a couple small children, and we've been to churches, but I don't care how early we start in the morning, we can't get there on time. They've always got it started, and we come in late. And as quietly as we try to come in, we can't sneak in without making some noise. And almost every time when that happens, the church people turn around and look at us with what feels like a sense of disgust. Why can't you get here on time? And he said, my experience with 12-step groups is that when I go in there and I'm late, they all stop the meeting and come over and give me a hug for making it. I said, I get it entirely. Paul Young, in his book, The Shack, and in the movie, there's a scene in the movie particularly where the lead character is sitting on a throne of judgment. And his responsibility is to judge actually between his two children, which one goes to heaven, which one goes to hell. And he can't do it. And that has become symbolic to me that, unfortunately, many of us in the church world have been trained to sit on the seat of judgment, to always be comparing ourselves to somebody else, to always be comparing people to what the ideal is. And the word should always comes up. Well, they should be doing this, or they should be doing that. That is not compassionate, loving, kind. That is judgment. And for some of us in the church world, taking ourselves off the seat of judgment is incredibly hard. It feels like we're, sometimes people say, well, you're giving people license to sin.
Right.
And my response is, they don't have to have a license. We're very creative, but it feels like there's something, somehow we're taught that my soul and my salvation is somehow connected to the people I influence for good. We all think about the stars in our crown. That's a nice song one way, but on the other hand, there's a kind of a trap door to that. Okay, then I won't have stars in my crown. Oh, I'm a failure. And again, nobody's intending to do that. But when we in the church world, and it goes way back, substituted morality for relationship, we got it wrong. We got it wrong. Jesus doesn't go around teaching morality, except in the sense of, here's some wise things to do. Here's some wisdom to do. And when you step back and you create the creeds and you create the measurements in order to control the organization and control the message and you suddenly get into an environment of judgment. Who's in, who's out, who's insider, who's outsider, who's right, who's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And we've done a great job of figuring out how to demonize other people. You know, the church I grew up in was always, at least we're not like those Baptists, or at least we're not like those Catholics. You know, there was no brotherhood or graciousness at all. It was like, good thing we're in. Hope they can come over and be on our side someday.
Yeah.
Which is trauma, and it really is.
Mm-hmm.
So we get, you know, when we start talking about the church and is it viable or not, and so on, people say, but we need community, and most of us agree we're hardwired for connection.
Yeah.
But many times the church is not a real community. It's not like a real family. But what would you say we didn't give you these questions ahead of time. What makes a good community? What are the essentials of a real community? I'm against trunk or treat, because I think you take people out of their real community to go, have a fake community, and it's weird. But I understand some of the reasons for it. But what makes a real community?
And I think this is a good question, because like when we talk about heart connection, how quickly that feeling of community is established, through the seminars. I mean, like if you think about it, like we still know people from that, like that really does become a community of sorts for people that go through heart connection.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Carl, I would challenge one of your statements. Is a lot of churches are just exactly like our families. Dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And maybe you've heard my speech about dysfunctional families, and it's not my stuff. It's been around for a long time, but there are three things that make a family dysfunctional, and the more these rules are in place, the more dysfunctional the family. The first rule is you are not supposed to talk about certain things. They're off limits. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. You certainly don't talk about it in front of other people, but you don't talk about it even with us. Or you talk about it, but we tell you what you perceive is not accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, that's not rage. That's righteous indignation that you see there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's probably rage. But what that does is it creates doubt in a child's mind that I know what I'm talking about, which in the larger sense is trauma. A child needs the attachment to know they're loved, valued, and seen, and can be heard and not deny their experience, not denied. It can be corrected, but not denied. So don't talk about it.
Can I stop you there? Can you dig a little deeper into that? Yeah. So not denied.
Not denied. Not in the sense of, well, I'll give you a little example. I think it's an example. We have this little 3-year-old running around our house a couple of days a week, and he loves rocks. And so he would go outside, and we have a lot of rocks, and he would pick up rocks. And I would think, well, those are not pretty rocks. Those are kind of ugly rocks. And I started to say to him, well, these are the pretty ones. And I thought, no, I'm not gonna tell him what he thinks is pretty or not.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little subtle thing. Or when he falls, the temptation to say, oh, you're okay. No, he's not okay. Mm-hmm. It denies his experience.
Got it.
Firsthand.
Mm-hmm.
It devalues his own experience.
Mm-hmm.
Subtle little things. A friend of mine points out, no one leaves childhood without exit wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And Laura, you deal with it all the time.
Yeah, for sure.
The inadequate attachment that infants have shows up in your classroom a lot. A lot. It shows up in church a lot. So the first rule in dysfunctional families is don't talk about it. Second rule is don't feel what you feel unless we've told you it's a good feeling.
Mm.
So how dare you feel that way? After all we've done for you, good boys and girls don't feel that way, and good Christians never feel that way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you've just been traumatized. Third, don't trust anybody. Nobody outside the family needs to know what's going on in the family. For God's sake, don't let the pastor know. What would people in the church think of us if they knew you did that, or your dad did that, or your brother did that? So don't talk about it.
Right.
Those three rules are perfectly designed to destroy real intimacy and authenticity and vulnerability.
I think that makes the situation ripe for abuse too.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's a setup for abuse.
Yeah.
And those three rules play out in work settings. There are a lot of places we work. We can't talk about real things. There's an elephant in the room, but we can't talk about it. We can't express our real feelings, and we can't trust anybody and not throw it back in our face. And unfortunately, those three rules show up in spiritual communities. So there's limited authenticity and limited vulnerability and a lot of covering up and denying, pretending.
Yeah. So you're close friends with Paul Young, is my friend too. Talks about sacred stories, that our stories are sacred. And so we listened to 3 months. We listened to a lot of female people. And they were telling stories of their trauma. A lot of them are from the IFB church and different things like that. But, Laura has taught me a lot in the past few months about how to listen to a story. Our last guest we had on, we asked him this question too. What do you think is important? Because, the people we encounter with church harm, with church hurt, we want them to see professionals and people like you. But as a friend, what's important about how we listen to them?
I think it's incredibly important. There's probably nothing more powerful in healing than having an empathetic listener who doesn't try to understand it or say, well, I understand, it doesn't try to get involved in the story, but is simply present and reflects back what they're hearing. There's Carl Rogers is one of my heroes. His Rogers was a psychologist or psychiatrist, and his whole premise of his whole work, by the way, he worked with Gendlin, was to just be empathetically present with people and let them tell their story. One of the worst things we can do for people is to encourage them to keep repeating the same story over and over and over and over and over. One of the things I dislike about some therapists is because it's like, well, tell me every freaking detail. It was traumatic the first time, and you tell it again and over again, it's going to be re-traumatized. It doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't matter what happened back there and then as much as it matters how is it showing up right now in your life. How is it complicating your moving forward? Our goal, healthy goal, is not how do I make every past issue in my life better so I can be over everything that ever happened to me. Our goal is how can I live forward? What's the next step? What's the next wise thing I can do?
Mhm.
And if something's in the way of doing that, let's deal with it. But if it's not in the way of doing that, I find a lot of people get trapped into working on issues that aren't real issues in order to avoid taking the risk of being authentic, vulnerable, and real.
Mhm.
Can you give an example of that?
Well,
Sorry, I'm kind of like, I got to create this picture in my head. So,
the other day,
I mean, it makes so much sense. I think I need to make a connection. So if you can dig a little deeper, maybe.
I've had people go through breakthrough and have great experiences and then come to me and say, well, now I did a lot of work in breakthrough, and now I've identified 3 or 4 more things that I really need to work on.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, because they're not finished yet. The question is, are they in the way of you taking the next step to create your life, to be authentic, to be real, and be genuine, to be loving, to be kind?
Mm-hmm.
Well, no. Then you're just rehearsing the past because your comfort zone is working with your wound rather than taking the risk of doing something outside your comfort zone.
Right.
Okay.
So the word sometimes people use is integration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we're trying to integrate that past or that part of us into the future, not it's not like the Model T in the garage that we keep polishing and trying to fix the rust. It's different, right? And we'll talk about focusing in a minute, but
I like integration is really important. To integrate my story, our trauma stories get lodged in our right brain and are not often in our narrative of our left brain.
Mm-hmm.
When we can tell our story, and we can tell it in a way, an empathetic presence, we can begin to integrate it into our narrative of our story to make sense. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it sits over in our right brain and it pops up in triggers. We get triggered by it.
Yeah.
Because it's not integrated in our whole narrative to get a part of our whole perspective. Use a different term. When we are traumatized, when we're triggered, back to a there and then, we're often triggered into the same language we had at the age of the trauma, rather than the age we are at the time we had the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example. I was working with a gentleman recently who was sexually abused as an 8-year-old by church camp counselors. And he knew enough about abomination to know what they meant when they called him an abomination now, because it was his fault. Mm-hmm. And he struggled with this his whole life. And so we got to a place working with focusing of he was in the presence of this little 8-year-old boy. Mm-hmm. And he was asking the 8-year-old boy, what do you want from me as an adult? And he said, the 8-year-old boy says to me, I want you to fight. And he thought about it. He said, I can't spend my life fighting. That'd mess my life up. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, that's an 8-year-old boy's words. Mm-hmm. What's an adult word that would be equivalent to that? And he thought about it. He said, advocate. Mm-hmm. I said, an 8-year-old boy doesn't have advocate as a word.
Yeah.
But the 8-year-old boy needs the adult to give him a word. Mm-hmm. And so advocate, that brought it together. Mm-hmm. We finished up, by the way, and I said, talk to me about what you're feeling right now. He said, I have an 8-year-old boy I'm aware his toes are in the sand and the hot sand and the wiggling and they're free. Mm-hmm. When we're triggered, we're often triggered back to the language and the feelings and limitations we had at the time of the trauma. Mm-hmm. And we need the adult to be present to bring us into current language and current resolution. So there's an integration process. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But to keep integrating is a way to not go call on somebody that I offended, or not go be loving for my spouse, or to avoid having a hard conversation with somebody that I have a difficult time relationship with. It avoids taking the risks of being present here and now and taking the next step.
Yeah, it's
It becomes a comfort zone.
Yeah, when I had my big event, I remember saying over and over again, "I got your back. I got your back."
Yeah.
And what I didn't mean is that I'm going to do this, like you just said, in the way that you think I should do this.
Right.
But I am going to nurture you, and I am going to have your back.
Right.
And we're going to and we can move forward.
Right.
Now together, it's integrated.
Right.
I want to. So I want to move forward because we kind of touched on focusing a little bit here and there.
Sure.
BioSpiritual Focusing. Can you explain that to us and the listeners? I'm all in on focusing. It's changed my life. I mean, the work you did with shame and early breakthroughs and so on was really good for us and helped us move along. But also focusing. Can you explain that to us?
Well, BioSpiritual Focusing is probably easiest described as focusing using the language of spirituality, not necessarily religion, not theology, but spirituality. A couple of Catholic priests who were psychologists who wanted to transform their church into a more healing, gracious community, struggled with what they were doing, trying to figure out how to do it. And they were counselors, and they ran into Eugene Gendlin and focusing. And so BioSpiritual Focusing is just taking what is focusing and being more comfortable with the language of spirituality. So Gendlin was a non-practicing Jew teaching at the University of Chicago and held in the big circles of psychologists and researchers. Well, you're not going to get much of an audience if you use spiritual language there. Mm-hmm. But he kept talking about as you are present with yourself, you are present with the whole larger process. He would use the term larger process, or he would sometimes say the larger more. Mm-hmm. And he would lend himself to these Catholic priests, and he would say, well, that's where you need to ask the more for where you're going with this. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that much different than focusing. There's some different emphasis in it, but it is acknowledging that that more we are in touch with ourselves, we are in touch with the holy, with God, with wisdom. One of the big challenges is that most of us in the Western Christian world hear Jesus as a savior and the atonement, and so we don't go to hell. Mm. There is a branch of the Christian church, which is not very well known, that in the earliest days, they spoke Aramaic, and they had a different track, and they interpreted Jesus as a wisdom teacher. Mm-hmm. I was talking to somebody the other day. Well, I posted it. This in Greek, the word "save," the Greek word there, also means healed. Mm. And the translator has the choice which word I'm going to use. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's an old saying: "All translators are liars." Because when in English, we like one word to mean one thing. That's why we have 3,000 words. Mm-hmm. In Greek, in Hebrew, you have about 5,000 to 7,000 words. Yeah. So the same word is used over and over and over in different contexts. Mm-hmm. And there isn't one meaning. There's layers of meaning. But in the English world, we translate usually from Hebrew and Greek into English. And we have arguments over the passages in Galatians. Are we saved by belief in Christ or of Christ? That's a huge debate in the theological world.
Mm-hmm.
The faithfulness of Christ is one way we can interpret it. Or the faith in Christ, which means it's now my job to have enough faith in Christ's faith, so he puts it back on me.
Mm-hmm.
I believe Jesus did not speak Greek. I'm sure he read some Hebrew because he had, synagogue and so forth. But I think he spoke Aramaic.
Mm-hmm.
And the Aramaic language lends itself to more of a, it's called a midrash, multiple levels of meanings, as opposed to one sentence, the translation. It can have different layers of meanings that are about wisdom.
Yeah. And no matter, where we draw the circle, if we say, okay, I thought, he meant this, and we draw a circle around it, it becomes a creed or a dogma.
Yeah.
And no matter how you look at it, that stops us.
I think Jesus left one creed.
Yeah.
Love God with all yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
Love your enemies.
Yeah. Can I probe down just a little bit more on just one thing? So, and I know because I've experienced it, Laura and I have sat with people, been witnesses or companions or whatever you say. Most of the time we try to get them to see somebody like you. But if I'm going to employ focusing, as we kind of inherit from Eugene and you, you've modified that somewhat, and based on your practice and so on. So when I sit down with someone, I start to tell my story, and they ask me. So the first thing that's always going to come up is, "What do you feel?" Okay, or part of me feels. So can you walk us forward a little bit more from there, based on how much you want to explain? I don't know about that, but just give us a sense of how that's helpful and how it works to some degree, whatever. Does that make sense? Is the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Carl, as you're expressing that, some frustration there.
Mm-hmm.
Is frustration a good word?
Probably not. It's probably confusion, maybe, or some kind of hurt, anxiety, maybe.
Okay. So where do you feel that in your body right now?
So I feel that in my upper belly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you to put a gentle hand there.
Okay.
And by doing that, you're just saying to your body, "I get it. You're here." That's a little anxiety. Is that the word you used?
Yeah.
Yeah. So rather than ask you what it feels like, I'm going to suggest you might sense what that feels like. What's below that?
Mm-hmm. Maybe kind of a abandonment, or I'm not connected.
Yeah.
Separateness.
So something's worried about being connecting or not connected, and okay. And so as you sit with that, you might sense what it's worried about might happen by not being connected.
Mm-hmm. Now, part of me feels like I don't belong.
Like what? Sorry?
Don't belong.
It doesn't belong. Okay. What I just did there is I didn't ask you what.
Mm-hmm.
What always takes us to our head.
Mm-hmm.
And what I suggest is, why don't you sense what's going on? Mm-hmm. Why don't you sense what it's worried about? You might tell me, you might let me know what you sense.
Yeah.
So it's the what questions always turn into intellectual discussions.
Mhm.
And so I think it is, what I said, I have a little piece in front of my computer here. Whenever I have a conversation, what comes here in the middle of your body as you're saying that. Okay, now we're present now. When somebody says, well, I'm feeling kind of heavy or anxiety or I'm feeling something.
Mhm.
Or if somebody says, well, I'm not feeling anything.
Right.
Okay, then how do you feel about not feeling anything? Oh, I feel horrible. We're
Yeah.
always feeling something.
Mhm.
We may not want to feel it. And it's about how to, as a person doing focusing, how do I help you get in touch with what's going on inside you? Not at an intellectual level, but at a deep feeling level.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if that answered your question or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, Gendlin said, what's unfelt remains the same.
Exactly.
So we need to feel it. And it's
Right.
it's important to be present with that.
Yes.
And then, what I've noticed, what happens in focusing is just, I think you call it a shift. It's a shift or something that
Right.
happens within us.
Yeah.
When that can kind of integrate with us, instead of, rehashing and trying to intellectually
Yeah.
pick it apart, right?
Yeah.
It definitely changes.
And the word I use these days is we suddenly are able to carry it differently.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change the details, but the way we carry it is different.
Uh-huh.
9 times out of 10, when a counseling session is really good, nothing has really changed. It's just the person now is carrying it different, has different perspective or carrying differently.
Yeah.
So let me, if you got a minute, I'll introduce you to another concept.
Okay.
In focusing, we begin with the premise that everyone is born with an inherent life-forwarding energy. Every child is born, now I'm sure there's exceptions, but generally, children are born with life-forwarding energy. They want a nipple when they come out of the womb.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know a nipple, but they want it. And they know how to suck, generally. And they want to crawl. They want to touch things. Nobody's coaching them. They have this inherent forward energy. Trauma happens when something interferes with that energy, blocks it.
Mm-hmm.
It can be resolved if the person is paying attention and is appropriate at the time. It can be resolved. When it's not resolved, we begin to develop protections about that not happening again.
Mm-hmm.
My old story is that 2 kids on a playground, they both fall. One goes to their caregiver. The caregiver takes care of it, kisses the boo-boo, encourages them to go to play. They go back out and play Weiser. Mm-hmm. Another child goes to the caregiver. The caregiver is inappropriate. What's the matter with you? Get out of it. Don't get out and play. They go back and play cautiously, not wanting to let that happen again. Looking back at the caregiver to see if they're smiling or frowning, worried, figuring out. When we have trauma, we tend to develop what I'm calling, or what Gendlin called, actually, I kind of adopted the term, structure-bound patterns of responses that are cut off from our feelings, but that protect us from hurt and protect us from feeling or processing. Call it bypassing.
Mm-hmm.
You know people who you've known for a while, and you know how they're going to respond to any situation. Some people are going to say no, no matter what you ask them, even though later on they come think about it and say yes. Mm-hmm. Or people are always judgmental, or they're closed-minded, or they're always making excuses, and it's a pattern that is closed-minded. It's just fixed. Mm-hmm. It's actually addictive. They're addicted to it. We can be as addicted to our defenses as we can alcohol or anything else.
Mhm.
My concern is that in the church world, that's what I'm getting back to. My church world, my church world, the behaviors that they considered, the structure-bound patterns they considered bad, getting angry, getting upset, doing things. What we learned to do is substitute other structure-bound patterns that they thought were good.
Mhm.
Tithing, church, attendance,
Mhm.
never expressing bad feelings, never being unhappy, always being, praise God, whatever.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And it wasn't a transformational process. It was just changing one structure-bound pattern for another structure-bound pattern.
Mm.
Mhm.
And we'll keep using them until they fail.
Mhm.
Two premises I've worked with all these years. Number one is, until we have a big enough crisis, nothing changes. As long as it feels more frightening, scary, painful to change, I'm gonna stay right where I'm at. I'm gonna be closed-minded. I'm not gonna believe anything else. I wouldn't feel safe if I did that. And second is, nobody wants answers to questions they're not asking.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah.
When you try to give people answers to questions they're not asking, yeah, it's over.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm sure you've had occasions where you have talked to somebody in professional life or whatever, and you can see in their eyes, they're not really hearing you. They're comparing what you're saying to everything they already know is true, and they're getting ready to either call you an idiot or to correct you.
Mhm.
They're not taking one word in
Yeah.
because they have a structure-bound pattern of life that they've organized their life around that, and they believe it with their whole life soul.
Mm.
To give it up would be so traumatic that they can't begin to believe how it's possible until it fails.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
So
Makes sense?
Yeah, it does. One thing I think that, like, when you were talking about focusing, that I think is so powerful and yet contradictory to my church experience is just the amount of I can't even think of the word now, but just the amount of permission you give someone to listen to their own body.
Yeah.
And in my church experience, and honestly, I can't really, the more I think about this, I can't really just say in my church experience. I think because of my my childhood, I really feel like I was ripe for the picking.
Yes.
For the church trauma to happen to me. I mean, right. I think it really all lent itself really well. But, in that experience, you don't listen to yourself. You deny yourself. Right. You deny how you're feeling. You deny, anything negative.
Right.
The anxiety, the discontent, whatever it is. And the thing I think is so powerful about focusing is, and it was really hard for me, if you remember the first time I did focusing with you, because I really, like, part of your brain is thinking, okay, what's the best way to respond to this? How am I going to sound like I'm not completely becoming unhinged? But even just taking a minute to listen to what your body's saying, that's hard if you've not been given the opportunity to do that. Or every time you have wanted to share how a part of you is feeling, it goes back to what you were saying about the dysfunction, those three dysfunctional things about a family or a faith-based organization. It's really hard to tap into what that part of you is feeling and bring words to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to go back to picking up rocks, what's the good rock and what's the bad rock? And if I keep telling him what the good rocks are and he picks those up, then he's going to catch my eye someplace else and pick up the rock he wants, because I'm denying his internal picking up the rock is symbolizing some feeling inside of him.
Mm-hmm.
And I can deny that feeling or discount that feeling accidentally, not even intended purposes.
Right.
So let me, you said something important about the being picked. Two terms, and I don't think it's new terms to you, but locus of control. Where do we see control? Where do we see authority? We can have external locus of control, meaning we look outside ourselves for fixes. We look outside ourselves for answers. We look outside because we don't trust ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Or we can have an internal locus of control where we begin to believe and trust ourselves, trust our own gut, trust our own feeling, trust our own internal wisdom. And we often beat ourselves up like, well, I had a gut feeling that wasn't right. I just didn't feel good about that, but we don't trust it. When my experiences as a child have been denied, or my dysfunctional family rules are in place, I'm going to be shifted to an external locus of control.
Uh-huh.
Who's right? Who's wrong? And so we can be attracted to authoritarian churches that are going to be willing to give us the right, wrong, black and white.
Mm-hmm.
We won't know that.
Mm-hmm.
But when we have an internal locus of control, we may go there, but it doesn't sit well. I don't like being told what to do all the time, black and white.
Mm-hmm.
I think for myself, which gets you in trouble in those settings.
Right.
But healthy spirituality is always about learning and moving toward an internal locus of control rather than simply an external locus of control.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what wisdom is.
Right. Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to take us off on a tiny rabbit trail because I'm a teacher. And so when you said that about locus of control and trusting yourself, that is something that I see in the classroom a lot. Like I will have students that color one aspect or write one word and they're like, how is this? Am I doing okay? So how, now I'm asking for advice. How as an educator, do I help them to, have that internal, locus of control or begin? Because I know like they have, like I'm not their primary caregiver. I'm not their family, and I understand that is where most of their, who they are comes from.
Right.
But I guess I'm saying like in the classroom, how can I help foster that so that because it is almost a, it's super attention seeking. You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
like they need, like they're craving that.
Yes.
And so I want to help them to understand, like, I want to see your final, and I'm going to be proud of whatever, if you did your best, I'm proud of whatever you put out there.
And I think every time you can do that, you're just planting a little seed. You're planting the seed that somebody sees me. Somebody sees what I'm doing here. I guess what comes to me too is, and with your level of education this may not apply, but I think it's incredibly important to validate children for the process of getting to what their result was, not just the result.
Right. Yes.
If you just validate the results and not the process, you're creating an ecosystem that nobody wants. And then kids who won't try because I can't do it perfectly.
Right.
But I think you'd probably do as good a job as anybody I know do, because you understand it. You're sensitive to it. A lot of teachers are not sensitive to it. The teachers I grew up with were not sensitive to it. It was it was right, wrong, black or white.
I had a colleague, an art teacher that I worked with at my old school, and I remember her telling me, like, don't, like, if I wanted students to draw an elephant, she was like, don't draw an elephant because they will try to do it exactly like you do. And
Yes.
then like, you're both going to be disappointed because it's not going to look like yours. And
Right.
they know it doesn't look like yours. And so it also has opened up the idea that each kid is creative and they see things differently. And so their elephant is going to look different than their neighbor's elephant. And that's okay. So anyway, I took us off on a rabbit trail, but that was good for me to hear because I think that's important,
I agree. So let me, if we're going to close, let me close with two stories.
Perfect.
The one story is a story about a woman who flew to sit by her mother's deathbed. And she was there several days. And toward the end, her mother, like sometimes happens, roused up. And she looked at her daughter and said, "All my life, I thought I was wrong." And went back down. A few minutes later, she raised up and said, "What a waste of life."
Mm. Mm.
Wow.
Yeah.
The other story is a story about a couple with a child, at least one child. And they had gone to Colorado or someplace on vacation and stopped at a restaurant. And they were talking to the waitress, and the waitress turned to the little girl and said, "I want a hot dog." And the father was kind of embarrassed, I think, and said, "No, she'll have a meatloaf and mashed potatoes." And the waitress looked at her and said, "Honey, what do you want on your hot dog?" Well, in the car after it was over, the mother reported, after the car was over, they were driving away. A little girl in the back seat said, "I think she really saw me."
Oh,
Mm.
oh, wow. Oh,
When we can be really seen
Mhm.
and really feel like we are understood and validated for what we are, we can really belong.
mm,
Until I believe you see me and you know my stuff, I won't really be truthful with you and I won't really belong.
mhm.
And therein lies the biggest challenge in any organization, whether it's church or work or wherever. To belong, I desperately want to belong. And I want to be loved, but I can't be loved until I'm fully known.
Mm.
And that's the risk.
Mhm,
Mhm.
mhm.
Yeah.
But that's the challenge too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been good as
Yeah.
always. One last thing. So what do you put on your billboard? You have a billboard the whole world can see. What does Dr. Paul Fitzgerald put on his billboard? Phrase or a sentence or two. What do you tell the whole world that you hope they get that'll make something different?
Life is intended to be living forward wisely.
Okay.
Live forward with wisdom.
Yeah. I love that part of one of your responses a while ago when you talked about living forward. My suggestion to that would be that every molecule and subatomic particle does that. It's a part of us. We're not living authentically if we're not. So
I remind people that in Hebrew, the word Moses got from questioning, "Who are you?" That four-letter word that is unspeakable is not a noun form; it's a verb.
Mm,
God is a verb.
mm,
yeah.
mm,
You're a verb. I'm
Yeah.
a verb.
Yeah.
mhm.
We're a process.
Yeah.
Trust the process.
Yeah. There you go.
We've heard that before.
Yeah, somewhere. All
How
right,
do
man.
how do people get in touch with you? So we've talked a lot about focusing and heart connection. And so if people are interested in learning more about that, or just maybe they heard something today and they want to touch base with you, how can they do that?
I on Facebook at Dr. Paul D. Fitzgerald. The HeartConnexion is spelled funny, HeartConnexion.org. And I have a website, Paul D. Fitzgerald. And I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn and
everywhere.
Instagram. And
Yeah.
Yep. Great.
You're connected and social media active for a person your age, for sure. No.
Well, one of my great thrills is teaching younger people social media skills. Artificial intelligence skills, writing skills are really fascinating right now.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary. We hope you find who you are as you embark on your own journey.
For all of us here at the Desert Sanctuary, be who you are, be where you are, and be at peace.